C10 center section contains the center section master tile. This contains the channel strip processing controls and the channel encoder function select keys. Below that, we have our primary monitoring controls. We have a section for adjusting secondary monitoring levels, for example, the levels of our mini loudspeakers, our AFL and PFL levels, dim, the amount of dim that we get when we dim the main monitors. Next to the master scroller, our navigation control, are 5 user mode keys. These keys allow direct access to projects. It could be a morning news show, afternoon sports report. Up to 5 C10 projects can be directly assigned to these keys. Again, this is for the less experienced user. He doesn't have to go into a menu to pick out a project. The key projects can be on these keys. Selecting a project automatically brings up the option to load that project. There is one level of protection to prevent inadvertent operation of this key clearing the current console settings. To the left of the miscellaneous level control are user keys. These are hardware keys primarily for any of the on-screen touch functions. So again, this gives you direct access to any of the functions that we normally access through the touch screen. And these keys, again, can be used in one of 2 ways. They can be used as 16 direct access functions, or they can be used in banks. And that function in turn itself can be made a soft key. So for example, I have this configured with 15 keys on the top level, and then if I need to, I can go into soft banks, and then I've got a further 5 banks of option keys. For example, to assign monitor switching to a pair of these soft keys, these free keys, we select the assignment process by hitting free. The labels start flashing. Select the key, question mark appears, touch the on-screen function that you want, and then repeat the process for the next one. So now you've got monitor 1, monitor 2. As well as our dedicated function keys on the control surface, we have a similar set of keys on the touch screen that can be used in a similar fashion. We can put on source selection. We can also use them as indicators. For example, 2 of these keys are actually used for power supply indication. So they are indicating the status of the main and redundant power supplies in the frame. So that's really the hardware in the center section. The most powerful part of the center section is in fact the touch screen. I just want to go through the various areas of the touch screen and the elements that they are controlling. Right at the top is our meter area. This area here is dedicated to displaying the program outputs. C10 has 2 dedicated program outputs. Either output can be run as a 5.1. At the moment I've got program 1 as stereo, program 2 as 5.1. We then have 8 audio subgroups. Here we've got 8 stereo audio subgroups. Optionally, we can reconfigure this with 2 5.1 and 2 stereo audio subgroups. Next to the meter is a bar that displays the actual level of the program faders or the audio subgroup faders. As you move the faders up and down, then you see the bars go up and down. Same with the audio subgroups. On the audio subgroups, you've got dedicated on-off for the subgroup, in which case if you deselect an audio subgroup, then the bar is grayed out. So all the time, this area here is giving you an overview not only of your levels, it's also giving you an overview of the status of the fader and the output on-off function. The meter between the 2 bar graphs is a kick-down meter that indicates the amount of compression being applied to an audio subgroup or a program output. Both the audio subgroups and the program outputs have built-in compressors available. Below our main console outputs are the metering panels for the mix-minus buses, for the auxiliary buses, and for 2 stereo, what we call communication outputs. These are stereo outputs that are used to feed production gallery speakers, speakers on the studio floor, presenters' headphones. They can add talkback and various other functions to the outputs. Next to that is monitoring. This links in with the dedicated monitor controls, but the on-screen controls are for source selection and for AFL and PFL metering. If I PFL a signal, then that's shown on the PFL meter. If I AFL a signal, that's shown on the AFL meter. The area below is an on-screen solo clear. Below the meter area are the function keys. These are divided into two sections. The bottom row are purely to do with functions that relate to the attention channel strip and the associated assignable channel controls located beneath. The top row is for center section functions and for additional options and setup menus. We saw earlier we were using the touch pan function. We can pull up a on-screen touch keyboard for doing naming, in which case that takes over the whole of that bottom area. Or we can bring up the menu for loading projects, or for example we can bring up the additional menu pop-up which contains additional menu keys for other functions. The touchscreen metering serves another function. It allows us to interrogate in a variety of ways all the outputs of the console. If I touch on an audio subgroup, then I get a pop-up that shows the processing in the audio subgroup and the signal flow through the audio subgroup. Having touched on subgroup 5, it shows me that the dynamics are in circuit. It has automatically assigned the dynamics parameters to the processing panel located beneath, and putting the dynamics in and out of circuit is now controlled by the dynamics in-out key located in the processing panel. Every subgroup has a direct output, and its source is controlled from the touchscreen. It can be pre or post the fader. There is assignable level control for the direct output. That is done through the encoder. So this time the encoder is used to control direct output level. And then we have on-screen buttons for tone and talkback. Meter source is controlled by touching the meter. And we have 4 options. We can meter the bus, the direct output, or pre and post fader and processing. And if we touch the processing area, then now we can go in and actually adjust processing order. We do that by selecting a piece of processing, using the encoder to change processing order. We get a very similar display on the program outputs. And this time the program outputs include a low-pass filter. This is for the LFE channel to filter out any high-frequency information. For our mix minus and aux buses, it's a simplified output structure. Primarily we have an on-off key, tone and talkback, plus monitoring. However, we do have a very useful function here, which is the ability to flip an aux send mix onto the faders. So normally aux send levels are controlled by our encoders using the function select keys. Hit aux to fader, and now I'm using my actual fader to control the aux send balance. The channel on-off keys become the aux send on-off keys. So that makes it very fast to set up complex balances for in-ear monitoring or presenters' headphones. When you've finished, turn off aux to fader, you go back to your channel strips. Again, things like aux to fader, if this is something that you want to do all the time, very simple, assign it to a soft key. Free, select the soft key, select the function. When you turn that off, then that becomes the aux to fader key. So you can see how quick and simple it is just to take one of the touchscreen functions and give it a hard key on the front panel. We have 2 other modes that we can use with this technique of touching one of the output meters. The first one is setup. This now allows us access to the various setup options for the outputs. For example, we go to Program, and that's where we can set our format for program bus 2. For 5.1 outputs, we can also set the fold-down coefficients for folding the rear channels back into the front left and right channels. And that's done with these 3 options here. For the audio subgroups, there's just a single display because the audio subgroup formats are global. You can run the audio subgroups as 8 stereo or a pair of 5 ones and a pair of stereo subgroup faders. For our aux buses and mix minus buses, there are a number of options available to us through the setup menu. This is where we can do stereo pairing. We can elect whether an aux bus follows the state of the channel on-off switch. And for quite complex operations, for example, feeding speakers on a studio floor, we can set a pre-fader mix-up that will automatically mute when you open the channel fader, or possibly for feeding audience fallback, we can send a pre-fader send that will mute when you take the signal out of the mix. And the final option is to globally set the pre or post fader status for a bus. So if I go global pre, you can see that everything on one indicates the pre-state by changing to a green display in the routing area. Post puts it back to post. When we select the aux functions to the encoders, then the soft switches above the fader become the pre-post selection, and there's 3 options. Post, global, pre. So you can follow global, or you can override the global setting from the setup menu and set it locally pre or post. We have the same options for the mix minus buses, so that although the mix minus buses are nominally post fader routing buses, they are actually capable of being used as additional aux sends. They have level control and they have the same options as an aux send bus. However, initially they are presented purely as routing options. But they can be used as aux buses as well, expanding the console to 24 variable aux buses. Finally, we have a reverse interrogation. We can interrogate the mix bus structure and find out what is being routed to a particular mix bus. So now we enable reverse bus, select a bus, and we're given a very simple display of 64 channels. This console is fitted with 64 processing channels, and that's how they're assigned to audio subgroup 1. And again, we can use the encoder to either scroll or page through the subgroups, so we can very quickly see how the console is routed. If, for example, we look at one of our mix minus buses, then we can instantly see how a mix minus bus is configured. To make a mix minus, push and hold, instantly you can see that every channel has been routed to that bus except 16. And then if we need to remove other contributions, then we just use these as muting keys, and this removes those contributions from the mix minus bus. The touch screen gives us very fast access for our console outputs. Touch and output, we're looking at the configuration and the control of the output. Hit setup, we're looking at the formats and the setups for the outputs. And finally hit reverse bus, and we're looking at the signals feeding those outputs. So with a simple set of keys, we have a very powerful approach to controlling the console outputs. C10 has a very comprehensive monitoring system that can be configured for a variety of different operational requirements. The main monitor output is a full 5.1 monitor output. C10 can be configured with up to 3 independent monitor outputs. The primary 5.1 monitor output is controlled from this section of the master tile. On here we have master, dim and cut keys, speaker level, and individual speaker mutes and solos. An additional set of controls selects the monitor mode, stereo, 5.1 or mono, with the ability to phase reverse and to invert the left-right monitor feeds. The secondary monitor output can be used as a near-field monitor output, or can be used as an independent monitor output with its own on-screen source selection. On the main monitor output, the source selectors intercancel. On the secondary monitor output, the source selectors intercancel and can be turned off. To use the second monitor output as a set of near-field monitors, the flip key routes whatever source is on the main monitor output to the secondary monitor output. If a source is already assigned to the secondary monitor output, flip reverses this routing. The secondary monitor output source is heard on the main monitors and vice versa. There are additional monitor options available by touching the monitor output. This allows us to have a 5.1 monitor insert for an external process. It allows a separate return signal to be used, what we call the alternate monitor return. This is primarily for use with Dolby Pro Logic encoding and decoding processes, so it's possible to listen to an encoded stereo Pro Logic signal. We have options for mono from left and mono from right, and we have identical options, mono left, mono right, for secondary or the mini monitor output. And here we have a mini level trim, so that we can trim the level going to the mini output separately from the main level, and individual monitor left and right cuts. Again, as we saw before, if these are key operational features, they can be assigned to soft keys. If we use the setup option, then this time we can determine where our AFL and PFL signals are routed. So we can choose to route AFL to the main or the mini outputs. We can choose to route PFL to the main, the mini, and a third independent PFL monitor output. This means that if we want a dedicated PFL mono or stereo speaker monitoring, we have a third independent output dedicated for this function. We also have the ability for this PFL monitor output to route external signals to it. For example, production talkback could be routed to this third monitor output, and through these mode switches at the bottom of this panel we can choose whether this external input is summed with the PFL signal or if the PFL signal replaces the external monitor feed. We can also turn this external monitor feed on and off. We have other options, what we call auto PFL dim. If we're listening to PFL on a separate speaker, then selecting PFL will dim the main monitor outputs. We can have what we call the mini main mono link, so that if you select mono monitoring on the main output, your mini loudspeakers also default to mono. The mini follow main option determines whether the mini output has independent level control or follows the main monitor output level. All in all, a very comprehensive monitor section. In terms of source selection for the monitoring outputs, in the miscellaneous menu we have access to 4 12-way monitor pre-selectors. External 1 features 12 5.1 monitor returns. External 2, 3 and 4 are all stereo monitor inputs. For external monitor 1 and 2 we can sum 3 sources. This allows the use of stems and the use of sum stem monitoring. And again, these external selectors can be assigned either to the dedicated soft keys, or we could use the user-assigned function keys as monitor selectors. The home screen is the top level of the C10 menu system. It displays the current project and the currently loaded project version, and it contains the help system as well as setting access levels plus access to the main system menus. The help system provides simple descriptive explanations for various front panel controls. To enable the help system, we access a channel using the attention key. We turn on the help system and select a function on the channel strip. For a rotary control, then turn on the help screen and then just touch the control you want help on. So this provides a very simple way for people to refresh themselves if they suddenly forget the function of a certain key, or just to do a self-learning process to gain additional knowledge about the console. Finally, right at the bottom of the strip is an area very similar to what is on the channel strip, but this time for 8 assignable master faders. So these faders, just like the channel faders, have an attention key, motorized fader, AFL and PFL monitoring, master on off, level, label, 2 soft keys. The type of functions that these can be assigned to are, for example, your main program outputs, audio subgroups. We have up to 16 VCA style master faders available. They can be assigned to the master outputs for the mixed minus buses or the aux buses. The type of program will determine what these faders are used for. They can even be used for channel strips. However, they obviously have no bus routing keys. For example, the way that this console is set up, I have my two main program outputs on the first two faders. I have 4 audio subgroups and then 2 VCA master faders. They aren't controlling an audio function, but they are controlling the levels of assigned channel strips. So for example, master fader 2 has been assigned to control this group of 8 channels at the start of the console. And as I move the master, then it just moves the relative balance of the slave faders. I can go in, I can adjust the relative balance of the slave faders, and that is retained. I can isolate a slave from the master just by touching it. So if I want to bring something up and bring the others down, then just by touching a slave, it's isolated from the moves that the master is making. There's a lockout system that prevents changing the balance or altering the balance when the fader is closed. So when the master fader is closed and I inadvertently touch the slave fader, it has a memory, so it retains the balance. It doesn't say you've touched the fader, it's going to stay closed when you open the master fader. There is a second option for grouping, and that's instead of what we call servo grouping, we can select a VCA style grouping. We do that by calling up the MISC menu, pop up, and then our fader group, and this fader grouping setup menu. And this time, instead of servo grouping, and you can see down here that we've enabled servo grouping lockout, and we've set a threshold, and basically what that says is if the slave faders are below -50, then they're in safe mode. You cannot alter the balance. Select VCA grouping, and now instead of the slave faders moving, the audio changes, but the slave faders still reflect the intergroup balance. This is very similar to grouping on consoles without moving faders, which just use VCA gain control elements. So with C10 you get both options. You get servo grouping, very visual, shows you exactly what is happening on the channel, or you get VCA grouping, which has certain advantages in terms of being able to monitor the balances when the master fader is closed, because the slave faders retain their position.